In relation to the government's announcement yesterday about the reopening of the retail sector from 16th August, we embrace that announcement as a positive step. However, we wish to reiterate our concern as to the vaccination rate in Trinidad and Tobago. And this concern is raised both in my capacity as the chairman of the Tobago Business Chamber and also in my capacity as an attorney at law and someone who has spoken out publicly on many issues in Trinidad and Tobago in the past. Our vaccination rate is still too low. Hence the reason the call was made a couple days ago by myself for the government to consider the question of the mandatory vaccinations for Trinidad and Tobago. This is not an entirely novel or unusual concept, as we in Trinidad and Tobago already have provisions for mandatory vaccinations. We may not remember it, we may not recognize the fact, but if you think back to primary school days where you had the implementation of Section 5 of the Public Health, Nursery Schools and Primary Schools Immunization Act, Chapter 2803 of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, and that is still our law. That is still on our law books. Mandatory vaccinations for you to be able to attend a public school in Trinidad and Tobago for primary school students. Okay? So, and that's the mandatory vaccinations against polio, smallpox, all these things. That is still our law. So, let's not go into histrionics and, get hysterical and, tear our hair out over the thought of mandatory vaccinations, because we already have it as part of our law here in Trinidad and Tobago, and we've all been subjected to it as children. Hence the reason we don't have smallpox or polio or yellow fever, all these, diseases which ravaged countries all around the world. So therefore, let's be sensible and rational and have some mature discussion about it. Any such policy for mandatory vaccinations will obviously have to cater for and take account of those who will have valid reasons for exceptions, and the law will allow for that. So therefore, any law that the government is contemplating would allow those who have, objections on religious grounds or personal grounds or health grounds, then of course you can make your case and apply for an exemption, and of course the government will consider it, and in the appropriate case they will grant the exemption. So it's not like you are force feeding the nation. But the point is, to get the vaccination rates up, we need to take a serious measure the same way that we had and we still have it on our law books in that legislation, the public health legislation for vaccination of primary school children. So therefore, if we are saying it's good enough for our children, why are we, the adults, being the ones who are being obstinate and resistant to it? And if we are, then maybe we need to have legislation passed so that way it can be a mandatory thing, of course subject to those who have valid reasons and valid exemptions. So it is something that was done, if we consider the law, and historically, if we look at it, in the UK in 1853, they similarly, and I mean we're talking, more than a century ago, they similarly had to pass the Smallpox Vaccination Act, which made it mandatory for UK citizens to be vaccinated against smallpox, because there was similar vaccine resistance, vaccine hesitance, and the anti-vaxxers. And this is since 1853. But in the UK, they recognized the imperative and the need to have such a legislation, to have such a law, because it was for the greater good. And of course, they also subsequently amended the law to allow for those who had valid reasons for exemptions, and they allowed those exemptions where you had a valid, claim. So therefore, in the same way, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has to consider at this point the mandatory vaccination legislation, and of course make provisions for those who have valid exemptions or valid cases that they can argue for exemptions, and let them make their applications and let them get their exemptions in the appropriate case. Because you're thinking of reopening schools in September. Schools provide the greatest scenario for mass spread of the COVID virus. That is a super spreader event. Having schools reopened fully, because the government says by October they plan to open it fully and have all students back in school. That's a super spreader event, because you're talking hundreds of thousands of citizens who are going to be there on a daily basis mixing with each other, and it's impossible to really monitor, supervise, and marshal and superintend hundreds of thousands of school students all the time, to insist that they always wear their masks, to insist that they always are socially distant. So therefore, we have to be realistic and understand that, look, if we want to get back to some sense of normalcy, and we all do, we all want to get back there, but the point is, there's a bitter pill we have to swallow, we have to face it, we have to deal with it, and the statistics show worldwide that vaccination is the best present available mechanism as a defense against the spread of COVID-19. In the US, 99.5% of all new infections are among unvaccinated people. Doesn't that tell us something? Worldwide, the statistics are the same. The unvaccinated persons are the ones who are getting infected with the virus. So therefore, and in fact, Dr. Fauci on Friday issued a statement, and it couldn't be clearer. He said the unvaccinated persons in the US present the greatest threat to public health at this point, because they're the ones who are contracting and spreading the COVID-19 virus. So therefore, that really is the situation. So when we look at Trinidad and Tobago, and you have more than 70% of your population unvaccinated, then that tells us that we are in a crisis that needs to be addressed urgently. We all want to have our beaches opened, we want our schools fully open, we want businesses back open, we all want to have our celebrations, be it Carnival, be it Hussein, be it Diwali, be it Eid, be it Christmas, Easter, we all want to get back there. But the reality is, if we don't understand that vaccination presents the fastest route to getting there, and if we don't apply that formula, then it's going to be a long, dark tunnel that Trinidad and Tobago is in for quite some time. So we have our choices, and of course, we all are able to discuss the ideas and have logical, reasonable, rational, mature discussions on it. There will be those who are for it, there will be those who are against it. And of course, that's part of human nature. And the views of those who are against ought to be considered by the government. So therefore, whatever legislation is drafted or crafted will consider their views. And as I say, there will be exemptions made. So therefore, you can apply for an exemption once you fall into one of the specified categories. So it's not something that you're force feeding on everybody. If you have a valid case for an exemption, then of course, you can make the application for the exemption. But the reality is that one way or the other, the fastest way for us all to get back to a sense of normalcy is for us to legislate to vaccinate.